I still remember the exact second my world cracked open. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet, suffocating way that only happens when the person who is supposed to love you the most decides, in front of an audience, that humiliating you is worth the laugh. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't someone I could walk away from and never see again. It was Daniel, my husband of 11 years, the man whose last name I had taken, whose children I had imagined, whose future I had folded so completely into my own that somewhere along the way I had stopped being able to tell where he ended and I began. And that night, a Friday, late autumn, the kind of evening where the air smells like wood smoke and the sky turns purple before it goes black, that was the night he looked me in the eye and chose the laugh over me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because to understand what happened that night, you have to understand who I was before it. And that means going back. Not all the way, just far enough to show you how a woman can be slowly, patiently, almost lovingly dismantled without ever realizing it's happening. I grew up in a family that believed in hard work and honesty. My mother was a seamstress. My father drove long-haul trucks. They weren't wealthy, but they were real, the kind of people who showed up when it mattered and didn't say things they didn't mean. My older sister Claire inherited my mother's sharp instincts and my father's absolute refusal to be underestimated. I inherited something different. I inherited the need to make things beautiful, to take something plain and transform it into something that made people stop and look. From the time I was 12 years old, I was drawing, designing, covering notebooks with logos and color palettes and typography experiments that I didn't even have words for yet. By my mid-20s, I was freelancing as a graphic designer. It wasn't glamorous. It was 2 jobs and student loans and a small apartment and a laptop that overheated if you ran too many programs at once. But it was mine, and I was good at it. I knew I was good at it, and knew I was good at it even when nobody else was paying attention yet. That was when I met Daniel. He was the kind of man who fills a room without trying. Tall, confident, the type who remembers your name after one meeting and makes you feel, somehow, like you've been friends for years. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He held doors open. He showed up. On our 3rd date, he remembered that I had mentioned offhand that I loved a specific kind of almond pastry from a bakery across town, and he drove 40 minutes to pick one up before coming to see me. That was Daniel. Or at least, that was the Daniel I fell in love with. We got married 3 years later. I was 28. He was 31. The wedding was small and honest, and I wore a dress I had co-designed myself, and I remember standing at the altar thinking that this was it. This was the beginning of the life I had worked so hard for. And for a while, it was. But things shift, slowly, imperceptibly, the way a house settles. You don't notice the cracks until one day. You look at the wall and realize they have been there for years. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I told myself I was imagining it. We were at a dinner party, friends of his from work, and someone asked what I did. Before I could answer, Daniel laughed and said, "She's an artist." You know how that goes. The table had smiled politely and moved on, and later, when I brought it up in the car, he said I was being oversensitive, that it was just a joke, that he didn't mean anything by it. And because I loved him, and because I wanted to believe him, I let it go. That was my first mistake. The second time was at his parents' house. Thanksgiving, 2 years into the marriage. His father asked about my work, genuinely, with real interest, and Daniel jumped in before I could speak. "She keeps busy," he said. "Freelancing, you know. She works from home." His father nodded and turned the conversation toward Daniel's career, which was thriving. And I sat there with a full plate of food and an empty feeling I couldn't name. Later that night, I lay awake while Daniel slept, and I stared at the ceiling and told myself it was nothing. He was proud of his career. That was normal. That didn't mean anything about how he saw me. But it did. I just wasn't ready to see it yet. Over the next few years, the pattern became so familiar, I almost stopped feeling it. He would introduce me at events as my wife, with no follow-up. He would refer to my business as her little projects. He would tell stories about our travels that made me sound like someone who needed to be taken care of, rather than someone who planned every detail of every trip we ever took. None of it was ever said with cruelty. That was the hardest part. It was always wrapped in that easy, charming humor of his, delivered with a smile that made people laugh and made me feel like I was the problem for not laughing along. I started to shrink, not physically, but in the way I moved through rooms, in the way I spoke about my work. I would pre-apologize for taking up space. I would qualify my accomplishments before anyone asked me to. I became an expert at making myself smaller so that Daniel could feel larger, and I did it so naturally, so completely, that I genuinely stopped noticing I was doing it. But something in me was keeping count. The dinner happened on a Friday in late October. Daniel had been talking about it for 2 weeks. 4 colleagues from his firm were coming over. Senior men, important men. The kind of men whose opinions shaped careers and whose approvals opened doors. He had told me more than once how critical this evening was, how it needed to go perfectly. And because I loved him, and because I still believed in us, and because somewhere underneath all the quiet erosion, I was still the woman who wanted his success as much as my own. I threw myself into it. I spent 2 full days preparing. I planned a 3-course meal. I went to 3 different grocery stores to find specific ingredients. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, rearranged the living room furniture to create a better flow, bought fresh flowers for the dining table, ironed the tablecloth that had been sitting in the linen closet for 2 years. I was not doing it to be seen. I was doing it because I genuinely wanted the evening to be beautiful. That was still who I was, underneath everything. Someone who cared about making things right. By the time the guests arrived at 7, everything was perfect. They came in loud and comfortable the way successful men often are. Greg, who had a booming laugh and the kind of handshake that could double as a power move. Marcus, quieter and observant, with intelligent eyes that moved slowly around the room. And 2 others, Richard and James, who finished each other's sentences and seemed to operate as a single unit. Daniel was at his absolute best that evening. Funny, sharp, magnetic. I watched him hold the room and felt the old familiar pride, the one that had gotten complicated over the years but never entirely disappeared. I moved between the kitchen and the dining room, refilling glasses, bringing out dishes, making sure everything stayed warm and timed correctly. And for the first hour, everything was fine. The food was good. I knew it was good, I could tell by the way they ate, and the conversation flowed easily, and I felt for a moment like maybe I had been wrong, like maybe this was going to be a good night. And then Greg pointed at the food, at the beautifully plated sea bass I had spent an hour perfecting, and said with a big grin, "Daniel, man, your wife is incredible. Did you marry a professional chef?" And Daniel laughed. And then he said it. "Nah, she's not a chef. She just has a lot of free time on her hands. What else is a housewife supposed to do all day, right?" The table erupted. All 4 of them. That loud, easy, careless laughter that men have when they're relaxed and among what they consider their own kind. And Daniel leaned back in his chair looking deeply satisfied with himself, the way he always looked when a joke landed exactly where he wanted it to. I was standing 3 feet away from him, holding a serving dish with both hands, and he did not look at me. Not even a glance, not even the smallest acknowledgement that I was a person in the room and not just a prop in his performance. I set the dish down on the table. I kept my face completely still. I said nothing. I walked back to the kitchen and I stood at the counter with my palms pressed flat against the cold marble, and I focused on breathing. 1 breath. Another. I told myself, not now, not here, later. But that wasn't the end of it. It never is with patterns. Because once something is exposed, you start seeing it everywhere. Over the next hour, the comments continued. Small ones, scattered through the conversation like seeds he didn't even realize he was planting. When the topic of finances came up, Daniel said casually, "I handle all of that. She's not really a numbers person." When Greg asked about a business trip Daniel had taken, Daniel told a story about a previous vacation we'd shared and described me as someone who panics without a plan. Which was technically true, but the way he told it made me sound helpless rather than organized, anxious rather than prepared. When James asked, genuinely, what I did for work, Daniel answered before I could open my mouth. "She does some graphic design stuff. Freelance. She makes her own schedule, which works for us." Graphic design stuff. 11 years. And that was what it had been reduced to. Stuff. Each comment was small. Each one was dismissible on its own. But together, stacked in that hour, in that room, in front of those men, they formed something I could no longer ignore. This was not careless humor. This was not nervousness or misdirected charm. This was a belief. A genuine, deeply held belief that my work was lesser, that my time was lesser, that I was lesser, and that it was perfectly acceptable to perform that belief for an audience. Something cold settled in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something more final than anger. The feeling of a decision being made. I was in the kitchen washing the dinner plates when I heard the front door. Not the guests leaving, someone arriving. I heard Daniel's voice change, barely, just a fraction, in the way it did when something caught him off guard. I dried my hands slowly. I walked to the hallway. Standing in my doorway, still holding her car keys, wearing a camel coat and the expression of someone who has just come from something important and is on her way to something else, was my sister Claire. Now let me tell you about Claire. Claire is 5 years older than me. She was the first person who ever told me my design work was extraordinary. Not good, not impressive, extraordinary. And she said it the way her father used to say true things, without decoration, without hedging, like it would be absurd not to say it. She had built her career from nothing, the same way I had, except that Claire's nothing had become something enormous. She was the founder and managing director of one of the most prominent creative agencies in the city. 63 employees, a client roster that included brands people recognized instantly, awards with actual weight behind them. She had been featured in industry publications, invited to speak at conferences, and consulted by companies that wanted to understand where visual culture was heading. She was also the kind of woman who walked into rooms and changed the air in them without trying. She'd not known about the dinner. She was nearby, she said, and she had left a book at my place the week before and just wanted to pick it up quickly. She hadn't planned to stay. She took one look at me standing in the hallway, and I watched her read my face the way only someone who has known you your whole life can. In a single second, with complete accuracy. She didn't say anything about what she saw. She just followed me toward the living room. Greg saw her first. I watched it happen like something in slow motion, the recognition crossing his face, the way his entire posture changed, the way he stood up from his chair with a speed that made his drink wobble. Claire Hendricks? His voice had completely transformed. Gone was the easy, performative confidence. In its place was something careful and almost reverent. I'm sorry, I didn't. How do you know? She's my sister, Claire said, nodding toward me. Daniel's my brother-in-law. The silence that followed was the most complete silence I have ever experienced in a room full of people. I looked at Daniel. I watched the understanding move through his expression in waves, confusion first, then recognition, then the specific, breathtaking panic of a man who suddenly comprehends the full weight of what he has been doing and who has been watching. The color shifted in his face. He laughed reflexively the way people do when they need to buy time, but it didn't land. There was no one left in that room to laugh with him. Greg turned to Daniel slowly. Your wife is Claire Hendricks' sister. It wasn't a question. It was a recalculation happening out loud. Daniel said something. I don't even remember what it was. I don't think it mattered. Claire sat down as though she'd been invited, which in every way that counted she had been, and within minutes she had drawn the entire table into a conversation that was warm and genuine and completely, utterly on her terms. She asked Greg about his company's rebranding initiative. She had read about it, she said, and the way his face changed when he realized she knew the details was something I will remember for the rest of my life. And then somewhere in the natural flow of conversation, she mentioned me, not dramatically, not as a performance. The way you mentioned true things about people you love, simply, matter-of-factly, as though it would be strange not to say it. She said that 2 of the foundational brand identities currently featured in her agency's portfolio had been built on design frameworks I had developed. She said she had been trying to bring me on officially for years, but that I was, in her exact words, one of those rare people who's genuinely more powerful working independently. She said the industry was finally beginning to catch up to what I had understood about visual communication for the past decade. She said it the way you say true things, and every word landed exactly where it needed to. I did not look at Daniel while she spoke. I looked at Greg, who was nodding with the focused attention of someone who was mentally revising every assumption he had made that evening. I looked at Marcus, who caught my eye and held it for a moment with an expression that was almost apologetic. I looked at my own hands in my lap, and I felt something shifting inside me. Not triumphant, not vengeful, just enormous. Like a door opening onto a space I hadn't known was there. Claire stayed 40 minutes. When she left, she hugged me at the door and said quietly, close to my ear, call me tomorrow. That was all. She didn't ask what had happened. She already knew enough. The dinner ended shortly after. The men left with handshakes and careful words, and at least 2 of them found reasons to speak directly to me on their way out, asking about my work, about my process, leaving in a way that felt like a correction of something earlier. Marcus paused at the door and said simply, it was a pleasure meeting you, really, and I believed him. When the door closed and the house went quiet, Daniel and I stood in the hallway and neither of us spoke for a long moment. He said, I didn't know Claire was going to show up. I said, I know. And then I said the thing I had been carrying for years. I didn't shout it. I didn't cry when I said it. I said it quietly, in the voice I use when I want to be heard completely. I said, you have been embarrassed by me for years, Daniel. You have stood in rooms full of people and made me smaller because it made you feel bigger. And tonight, the only reason you're standing here feeling ashamed is because someone important saw you do it. Not because you finally understood what you were doing, Not because you thought about what it costs me every single time, but because it cost you something for once. And I need you to understand that is not the same thing as seeing my worth. That is just finally feeling the weight of ignoring it." He didn't answer. There was nothing to answer with. I walked to our bedroom and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and I let myself feel all of it. The humiliation, the exhaustion, the grief of understanding that the person who should have been my safest place had been quietly, consistently choosing otherwise. I let myself feel the anger that I had been folding down for years into something smaller and quieter and more manageable. I let it all come. And underneath it, underneath all of it, I found something I had not expected to find. Clarity. Not happiness. Not relief, exactly. But the clean, unambiguous feeling of a woman who has finally stopped lying to herself. That night was 8 months ago now. We went to counseling. It was not easy, and I will not tell you it was, because that would be dishonest. And this story has had enough dishonesty in it. There were sessions that left me hollow. There were truths Daniel had to sit with that took him weeks to fully face. The pattern behind the jokes. The insecurity that had been running underneath his charm for years. The way he had built himself up by quietly tearing me down so incrementally that he had convinced himself it wasn't happening. That kind of reckoning is painful to watch, even when you're the one who was hurt. Even when some part of you thinks, good, it should hurt. It should cost something. But he did the work. Slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and hard nights and more than one conversation where I wasn't sure we were going to make it through. He did it not because I required it as a condition of staying. By that point, I was fully prepared to leave. But because he finally, genuinely chose to. For himself, for us. For the marriage that still lived underneath all the damage, quieter and more fragile than before, but still breathing. I will not tell you we are perfect now. We are not. But we are honest. And after years of performing a version of our marriage for other people, honest feels like the most extraordinary thing in the world. My business has grown in ways I no longer feel the need to minimize when I talk about them. I took on 4 new clients this year. 1 found me through Claire's direct recommendation. 2 others found me through work that had been circulating in the industry for longer than I realized. I have a waiting list now. I have a waiting list, and I say that plainly and without apology, which is something the woman washing dishes in that kitchen 8 months ago could not have done. Last month, Daniel's firm held its annual industry event. A big room, important people, the kind of evening where first impressions still matter. He introduced me to his colleagues, not as my wife, not with a joke, not with an edit or a qualifier or a careful deflection. He said, "This is my wife. She runs her own design agency, and she's genuinely one of the most talented people in this room." He said it the way you say true things. And I stood there and I received it. Not with relief that I finally had his approval, because I had learned in those 8 months that his approval was never the thing I was missing, but with the quiet recognition that growth had happened. Real growth. The kind that costs something and means something precisely because it costs something. I'm telling you this story because I know there are women who are living inside a version of it right now. Women who have learned to make themselves small enough to fit inside someone else's story. Women who have gotten so good at minimizing their own light that they have started to believe the minimizing is the truth. Women who press their palms against cold countertops and breathe and tell themselves, not now, later, it's not that bad, I'm being too sensitive. I was that woman. For years I was that woman. And here's what I want you to know. What I would travel back in time to say to myself standing in that kitchen, heart closed, hands cold, holding myself so carefully together, you are not too sensitive. You are not the problem. You are not small because someone who should know better has been treating you that way. Your work is not stuff. Your time is not free time. Your life is not a supporting role in someone else's narrative. You are the main character of your own story, and no one, not a husband, not a room full of laughing men, not years of quiet erosion, can change that unless you hand them the pen. The laughter at that table still lives in me. I won't pretend it doesn't. Some things leave marks that don't completely disappear. But so does the silence that came after it. And in that silence, in the exact moment when a room full of people finally saw what had been true all along, something in me came back to life, not because Claire walked through that door, not because the men at that table changed their minds, not because Daniel finally felt the weight of what he had been doing, but because I stopped waiting for someone else to confirm what I already knew. I was always worth it. I just finally believed it. And that was the beginning of everything.